Hello, everyone. This is Conscious Leaders. It's a series where we talk to business leaders and their advisors about the world of work. We cover the essence of leadership and how different management styles have met the challenges of the pandemic, its mass disruption, and asking what happens next. We tackle some tough questions like what's the future of the workplace and what are the new techniques and initiatives designed to support hybrid as we attempt to integrate work from home with some office life. Today, I have the great pleasure to speak to Richard Gerver, advisor, author, TED talker, and educator. And as my husband says, who's also my co-founder, however hard you try, you can't put this man into a box. Richard made his name initially as headmaster with the Midas touch. Over the past 2 decades, Richard has taken the frontline experience and distilled it into a lifelong conversation around the nature of education and leadership. And he argues that great leadership is first and foremost about serving the people who work for you. And the mantra that I've heard, he says, is all about people. So systems and structures change nothing, people do. So Richard, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure to have you.
Oh, Gret, thank you so much for having me. And anyone that gives me a build up and an introduction like that, I'm more than happy to spend the whole day talking to. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad because I actually said, is this uncomfortable for Richard to hear about himself like this? And Tommy was like, no way.
Yeah, I mean, it depends whether you want the public answer or the private answer to that question.
Well, we're going to continue talking a bit about you, and I'd love you to just set the scene about your career as a teacher and really looking and letting us know if that defined the rest of your professional career. So talking about your early years into education and where you are now.
Sure. Well, I mean, my life really has been an extraordinary journey of the unplanned, of avenues and steps I've taken in directions you could never have forecast, that has taken me to places I would never have imagined in my wildest dreams. I mean, I started out as a London boy who had a dream to be an actor. That was all I wanted to be. And right the way through to the time I was about 19, all of my energy and my ambition was kind of focused on that. And in many ways, looking back, a number of things. One, the courage of my mother to allow me to follow that path when, my friends were focusing on A-levels and university courses, and there I was plowing on, was extraordinary. So there I was leaving school at 18 and got myself into repertory theatre, which is like semi-professional theatre on the outskirts of London. And as an arrogant 18-year-old thinking, that's it, I'm Laurence Olivier, I'm ready, I'm here world. There was one very serious flaw to my plan, which was actually, in essence, I was rubbish as an actor. And then love stepped in. And love is going to be a recurring theme, I think, of our conversation today. Because in the first year of my degree, because I delayed going to university for a couple of years, I met a young woman who was in the final year of her degree. And I was desperate to, go on a few dates and have a bit of a relationship with this incredible young woman. And she was just about to graduate and qualify as a teacher. Anyway, on one of those early clumsy dates, the sort of the sick, when you look back on it now, the kind of sick making conversation. I remember being at a bar with her one night and saying, oh, laying it on thick, Gret, teaching's what the best job in the world. And it clearly worked for a while. Anyway, our relationship flourished. And when I finished my degree, she'd remembered that conversation. And she said, how you once told me that teaching, yeah. And she said, how you're really still not quite sure what it is you want to do? And yeah. She said, well, I've enrolled you for a postgraduate qualification to train as a teacher. So that's how I got involved in education. And she was right, of course, and not just because I tried to score a date. And by the way, just for people to know, how she's humored me, I don't know, because we celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary this year. So it must have kind of turned out all right. But I remember the first time I walked into a classroom. And I'm sure people in a whole range of worlds and fields can identify with this. I walked into a world that I hadn't anticipated was going to be a world I was going to engage in, and found myself in an environment and thought, this is where I belong. And how did I never realize that this? So that really is what got me involved in education. And I think all of the passions and all of the experiences I've had since in my life have been a culmination of the two core passions in that early part of my life. One is acting. And I think for me, the joy of acting wasn't so much the performance as it was climbing inside the head of characters, but also in terms of trying to identify how you entertain people, how you make people happy, how you connect with an audience, all of those things, which of course fed into, I guess, my passion for education, which, if you think about it crudely, is a classroom, an audience of people who can't leave if you're rubbish. So I had a captive audience. But the thing about human potential, that thing about a desire to truly understand what makes people tick, to harness it, to connect with them, to communicate with them, and hopefully to try and make their world and my world better, I suppose is intrinsically at the heart of everything that's flowed since.
I have a similarity to you, because I actually did want to be an actor as well when I was a child. Unfortunately, my parents were not necessarily as open about it as your mother was. But I think it's really interesting how that connection and that idea about being on stage, it's actually quite similar to a teacher, because you're in front of a group of people and you do need to keep them entertained and interested in whatever it is that you're presenting, you're talking about.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, there's that element, but there's also the deeper passion to really climb inside who they are, what they want. One of the great talents of, not that I clearly was ever one, but it strikes me that one of the great talents of truly great performers, and particularly actors who perform on a live stage, is that incredible ability to connect on a human and emotional level with your audience. You see it not just in actors, but in all kinds of live performers, particularly in musicians and that kind of thing. And I think for me, it's very easy to sometimes look back on your life and start to try and piece together some of those wild bits of narrative that didn't seem to be coherent at the time. And I think for me, that absolute, I suppose, desire and fascination in that human connection, and I suppose the emotional intelligence it takes to really build and develop meaningful relationships in that way.
So can we talk a bit about Grange and your job at Grange, and why that was so transformational, and how you actually managed to transform that school?
Sure. So again, look, I told you, love is going to be a major part of this. So at the time, I'd been through, the first part of my career as an educator. I'd gained various promotions and actually had just stepped out of being a deputy principal and had actually been seconded by the government at the time to try and develop a program to remotivate demotivated, specifically boys, in reading and writing. And as part of the program, as I was developing this program, we also had to try and get certain targeted schools involved in the process to get their students on board. And one of the schools that I was asked to try and persuade to get involved was this primary school, this elementary school, Grange. So the age range of the pupils was 3 to 11. And there were about 500 kids in this school in a very challenging urban environment. And I remember walking into the school, so becoming a school principal was not on the agenda. It was purely to get this school involved in my program. And I was introduced to the assistant principal, who was acting principal at the time. And she showed me round, and I fell in love. I fell in love with this school. I can't explain to you why in that one afternoon, because it changed my life in essence. You could walk into 100 buildings, much as many of us do, when we're house hunting. And you can see maybe a dozen houses that on paper look exactly the same, or even on plan, right? But then you walk into one, and for some reason you can feel your soul in the place, whether it's imagining Christmas there, whether it's imagining having your family there, or what, right? That something. And I fell in love with this place. And actually, the amazing thing about the school was that it had no substantive principal. So the existing principal had been off on long-term sick for 18 months, was being taken through ill health capability. There'd been 8 school principals in 10 years. And it turns out the school was a complete and utter mess. But I applied for I couldn't help myself. I wasn't looking for the job, right? But I just, you know, again, sometimes I'm sure people experience it in a whole walk and range of parts of their lives. You have a moment and an experience, just can't wrench it, you know, in the semi-sleeping hours, in those moments, it's like a woodpecker kind of. And so I applied for the job. Anyway, I got it, not because I was talented, not because I was some sort of super educator, and it turns out, and this is true too, Gret, when I went to sign my contract with the director of education in the local government, he said, "Thank God you applied." I said, "Oh, really? Thank you very much." He said, "No, because you were the only applicant." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And it turns out, I mean, talk about ego going from like hero to zero. It turns out that everybody else who was like kind of eligible or would have been in the running for that kind of job had realized that the government had classified that school so bad that they were thinking of closing it down. Luckily, I didn't know that at the time and got the job. Anyway, what I found, and I suppose what I'd fallen in love with, of course, before I'd really, you know, the director of education didn't give me that news until I'd signed my contract. But I'd fallen in love with the spirit and soul without knowing about, if you like, how bad the situation was. And I suppose my instinct was right, because the spirit and soul was remarkable. There was underneath all of that an amazing group of people who kind of needed bringing out of themselves, who needed re-empowering. And we may come back to this theme as we talk, right? Because they were a community that felt totally disenfranchised, a group of professionals that were used to having stuff done to them. So spending their lives being largely reactive, having their passion kind of extinguished under layers of the concrete of new initiatives that were top down. And I suppose for me, the joy was I felt this germ of something, of love, of passion for the place, of a sense of purpose. And I suppose really my job was to strip away some of the obstacles and some of the things that these people had felt under duress about, re-empower the community, give them the opportunity to express, articulate, and develop a real meaningful vision for their children in their community, and find ways to activate it. And so what I found was my instincts were right. You know, when you created the conditions for these extraordinary people to grow, these people who'd been labeled failures, at the end of their 10th, there were a number of staff who were off on long-term sick, some who'd become aggressively unionized. What you found was you were able to harness the power of a community who did extraordinary things. And to the extent that within 18 months of us starting out together, they had transformed that school from one of the worst in the United Kingdom to one of the most celebrated in the world. You know, we won the UNESCO World Education Award after 18 months of being classified by the British government as one of the worst and beyond salvation in the English school system. So yeah,
I mean, that's pretty incredible in and of itself. And obviously those not just the pupils there, but the teachers needed someone to guide them.
Excuse my dog, to everyone listening to this. She's obviously agreeing with you.
They needed you as a leader, clearly.
Did they? I tell you what, I went into leadership when I look back on it now, I think, because I was very young to be a school principal. I was 32. Which is relatively young to be a school, 31 actually. And I went into the job now, thinking back on it, with what I think are two very powerful characteristics for a new leader, a real powerful mix of ignorance and arrogance. I was arrogant enough to believe that my philosophy was right, and I was ignorant enough to have no idea of what the obstacles or the stumbling blocks might be, or the reasons why I might not be. And I think what that did for that community, you know, they'd had this conveyor belt of leaders before who'd gone in, who were probably highly experienced, wise professionals, who had gone in, I think, and just gone, right, we need to implement this system, this system, this system. And what that did for those people was underline how disenfranchised they were. I went in my naivete. Now, of course, I can make it sound like I was wise and I had all this extraordinary knowledge of what great leadership was. I didn't. But I went in there with a very different philosophy. And I think that openness, that breath of fresh air, that commitment to community and galvanizing community, to a much less hierarchically based system of leadership. After all, you know, there were members of staff in that school, senior members of staff, that had been working in that school for 34 to 35 years. They'd been working in that school longer than I'd been alive. And so, you know, when you think about that, that's quite a daunting thought. And I suppose I stumbled across that, you know, we reconnected with their passion. I remember I asked two questions very early on in my tenure as the leader in that school. The first was a very general one, because I did genuinely believe we as a community had lost sight of what we were doing. We had become so reactive. We had become so kind of tied to doing what other people were telling us. You know, people were implementing policies from above, from outside the community, that actually the community had lost sight of its own vision. Again, we might come back to this later, but it's really interesting to me that when you look into the research, really over the last 20 years or so, about the number one cause for job dissatisfaction, it's never about how much people are paid. It's always around something to do with, if people are dissatisfied, it's always to do with a company's inability to articulate and act upon its vision and values, right? And again, I didn't know this at the time. Now I do. But I guess in a way that was the point. I went in there and the first question I asked was, what do we want our children to look like as human beings by the time they leave us? Now, to me, I thought it was a pretty clever question, but actually it reignited a sense of ownership from that community, because suddenly they were able to articulate and felt they had ownership of where we were going and what we were doing. And the second question I asked, again, specific to education, but I hope people can see the generics, was, how do we make our school as exciting as Disneyland? In other words, how do we create an environment where people are queuing up every day because they can't bear the thought of missing out? And I think what that did, by looking back on it again now, by creating open-ended questions at the start of the journey, you truly make people feel that they're stepping in to an environment where they're empowered, where their voice matters. And of course, then the next great trick as a leader is not just to play lip service to that, but to immediately epitomize and back that up with action. But certainly when I look back now, the open-ended nature of drawing the community into the conversation rather than going in there as a leader with a predefined idea and imposing that on that community, I think had a profound impact on what happened next.
Yeah, and I think that idea of, I mean, leadership, and we can talk about this now, actually, that the old view of leadership versus how leadership is now and how it's changed. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that, especially now with the pandemic and how things continue to change.
Again, you know, you and I both know, because of the worlds we work in, this is such a massive issue right now. And in a way, and this may sound controversial to people, there is part of me that thinks the pandemic as hopefully we come through this and find a way to live a kind of normal life that isn't as interrupted by this thing in the future, has not all been bad if we actually take a step back and analyze what we've learned from that process. And I think there is, you know, many of us have talked about leadership in newer terms over the last 20 or 30 years, but most organizations have been so busy being efficient, right? Focusing on productivity, and found it so hard to find the mental time or space to step out of that culture to re-examine. The weird thing is, in some ways, the disruption of the last 2 years has given us time to action research, right? And for me, what I think is really, really clear is this. There are two types of organization in terms of leadership and management, as you hinted at. A very traditional model, which I think is still the majority of organizations, particularly in certain parts of the world, which operate under what I call the assumption of incompetence. In other words, really rooted in that traditional Taylorist model of a focus on efficiency, increasing productivity. Productivity drives profit. You drive the profit back into a focus, and you create that circle of industrial development, right? Which was great when the world was turning slower, when product was king, when refining and perfecting service and product was the answer. And of course, what we've realized in the last 30 or 40 years, particularly, I suppose, because of the technological explosion, because of the global economic shifts, the environmental shifts on the planet, all of the things that we're now dealing with, we began to realize that actually the world was turning faster and business needed to turn faster too. And it's fascinating that the most agile of those businesses have been, if you like, traditionally the tech startups who didn't have a culture they had to work to or anything they had to spin round. So in traditional organizations, there's an assumption of incompetence, which is kind of based on the idea that people will only do their best work if they're managed to do their best work. So they're low trust environments where you assume people go in every day purely to earn enough money to give them the things that they can get in life. And actually you have to use traditional performance management techniques. You have to use traditional target setting processes or traditional professional development platforms in order to get people up to do their job. So we manage them assuming they'll do less than their best. And all of those management and leadership techniques are kind of predicated on leading and managing up. You know, they're almost, most of them around compliance. How do we make our people comply? What, of course, you see in the world's most dynamic organizations is what I call an assumption of excellence, which is the other way round, where you assume the people who are working with you are passionate about what they do, who deeply care and have the talent and skills and knowledge to make that stuff happen. Now, what that means is you actually spend far more time in terms of leadership rather than on compliance. You spend time on culture. And what you do is you devise and design cultures which allow those people to flourish, to do that. So they don't have to prove to you they're okay before they're given the promised land. The promised land is there.
You mentioned trust, and I think that's an important one to pick up on, and how important it is for a leader to trust their teams, but also to have teams trusting one another. And I wonder if you could talk about trust a little bit more.
Yeah, again, you know, it's really, really interesting. I don't know if you've come across, or any of our listeners have come across, the research that was carried out a few years ago by Google into what made their most successful teams, you know, Project Aristotle. And of course, one of the things that was high on that list of what made those teams successful, as well as things like psychological safety, was dependability. The absolute belief and trust in everybody else in their team that they would all do the best they could, you know, and I think that was really important to us at Grange, which was a typical low trust environment where in a school context, teachers teaching in different year groups would blame the teachers teaching other year groups for underperformance, or the teachers responsible for specific subjects would blame those other, so much as you would in a corporate environment where finance blame HR, blame marketing, blame L&D, you know, blame R&D, all of those kind of things. And I think what was really important for me was first of all to get people to understand the collegiality that comes actually from understanding rather than ignorance. Because again, I think one of the greatest problems in low trust environments is actually they're places where ignorance flourishes, because people don't actually know what kind of pressures and challenges other people in other teams or other departments are under. And there was a wonderful example. I'm a big sports fan, and football, soccer is one of my passions. And I remember as a child being fixated with the Dutch national soccer team, who at the time were managed by a guy called Rinus Schmeichels. And Rinus Schmeichels had also managed at the time one of the sexiest teams in the world, which was Ajax, which was also a Dutch side. And he'd invented something called total football, which revolutionized the game of soccer. And what it meant was that every player seemed to be comfortable playing in everybody else's position. And when he was asked about that, he said it was a very deliberate strategy. And he said he'd broken the mold of the way soccer players were trained. So rather than just the attackers being taught to be better attackers and the defenders being taught to be better defenders and the better, midfield, all the rest of it, what he actually did was he made every player train in everybody else's position. And he did that so that every player knew the challenges that every other player was under, so they could all emotionally understand and engage on what it took, both when somebody was underperforming or overperforming, but their role in helping each other enhance their jobs. If somebody had said to most organizations 2 years ago, your people or the majority of your people are going to be working from their home environment pretty much all of the time, there would have been meltdown in a huge number of organizations, right? And there was, when people started to come to terms with it. And there was a whole lot of talk about reduction in productivity and people trying to get away with stuff. And, it goes back to what I was saying before about an assumption of incompetence, right? That people, well, how am I supposed to manage my team if it's all remote? And actually, what we saw happen were a number of things. One, actually, a huge percentage of people became more productive. And yeah, they weren't necessarily clocking on at 9 in the morning and clocking off at 5 or 6 in the afternoon. Many people were following their biorhythms and going, right, I work best from 6 in the morning until 12 in the afternoon. And we were finding they were being far more productive in 4 or 5 hours than they were in a work day, right? And suddenly they were, wow. Also, people, when they were working, were more present because actually they were able to juggle family life and personal issues, whether they had children or they were caring for parents or relatives. Suddenly people were more connected. And what we as managers and leaders need to reflect on is that actually, that old adage that you leave your personal life at the door shows professionalism is actually really unhelpful. And actually the empathy that really reflective leaders will have picked up over the last 2 years, although many of them knew it already, and it's underlined it for them, is the power of trust, the power of flexibility, the understanding that actually personal life is vitally important in professional performance. I remember speaking a number of years ago to Professor Steve Peters, who some people might remember wrote The Chimp Paradox, and has been very powerful in working with mindset with British Olympians and British sports people. And there was one cyclist in particular he had a profound impact on, an incredible, a multiple Olympic gold medalist now, a woman called Victoria Pendleton. And what they discovered through working together was Vicky's professional life. She worked hard, she was focused, but actually it was the turmoil in her personal life that was causing the lack of performance. And actually, by working through that with Steve and helping her understand paralleling and bringing those things together, allowed her to create a much more settled environment, which allowed her actually to perform at a much higher level professionally. And as a result, she went on to become a multiple gold medal winning Olympian. Going back to COVID, we are all rightly going to reflect, because of our mixed and sometimes shared experiences of the last 2 years. We're going to talk about the struggles. For some of us, it's meant profound loss personally, professionally, the instabilities. But actually, what I also urge people to do is take a step back and say, hold on a minute. we came through this. We may not have come through it unscathed. It may not have been perfect, and it certainly hasn't been a bed of roses, but we've come through this. And actually, that's down to our personal skills, knowledge, experience. It's because of the people we've been able to lean on and support. It's because of our professional innovation and integrity. And actually, what I really hope is we don't just talk about how awful it's been, but we reflect on the strengths we've uncovered in ourselves that we didn't know we had 2 years ago.
Yeah, and finding that silver lining, because not all of it was bad. It actually gave a lot of people a bit more opportunity. And a lot of people have learned a bit more about themselves and had the chance to try new things, do things in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly right. And we have to find time to celebrate the achievements. Again, I've been fortunate enough over my career to interview some really interesting elite athletes, people that have been at the very top of their game. And one of the things often many of them reflect on in their retirement is they never spent enough time celebrating their successes when they happened.
I love that. That's so good, because actually it's one of the things that we talk to our clients about. It's like you have to reward and recognize people, like even the little things.
Yeah.
Just something little is really useful to celebrate. Can we talk about the future of work and your views of hybrid?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, first of all, I think we've already touched on it. Anyone who makes the mistake of thinking, hopefully the world will spring back to normal and we'll all go back to what we were doing before, is, I think, in a very difficult and challenging position, because I don't think that's going to happen. I think Pandora's box is open. I think the genie is out of the bottle. And I think, we've already touched on this thing about how powerful some of the hybrid experience has been over the last couple of years. I think the next generation coming through were already almost naturally hybrid thinkers. And actually, they're now going to start to expect to be able to work all over the world without ever having to leave their home base. They're going to want to be flexible. They're going to want to do the home work environment. And I think what's really important is that we don't make the mistake of believing one is better than the other, that we don't make the mistake of polarizing those experiences. And actually what we realize is that they're tools used at the right time to maximize what it is we do and achieve. There's absolutely no doubt about it that the ability for people to work flexibly that digital technology allows is a wonderful thing. However, we've also got to realize and respect the power of human interaction, of the chemistry that goes on when people are in a room and space together. But that doesn't need to be all of the time. And so I think what we need to do is be more strategic and targeted about how and when to use remote working and how and when to use live working. But I think anyone that thinks it's either or, frankly, is going down the wrong track. Really smart. Hold on. It's the postman. The dog will stop in a minute. Right. Really smart people will realize and recognize that actually we need to look at those variants of the working environment as tools that are now firmly in our box. And I think the best organizations moving forward in the future will create really interesting ways of creating that hybrid environment for their employees.
Yeah. Are there certain questions that businesses and their leaders can ask as we enter into this new era in terms of how they can evolve, how we can all evolve?
I think for me, so much of it, again, is understanding each individual, those people, what helps them work best. Because, there is no doubt about it. Some people have really struggled with their mental health by having to work alone in a room in their home, but some people have really flourished. And the point is, I think the big question we need to be aware of is not everyone is the same. Even people that have got the same skills, the same knowledge, work in the same team, the same department, do the same job. That actually what we have to do is be far more personalized about that offer and give people the opportunity where they can to work and flourish in the environment they feel most comfortable and doing it best. And I think therefore flexibility, and the question most leaders need to ask is, what is it that the people I work with need most to to accomplish that assumption of excellence. And they will all need different kinds of working environments. You know, I've got to a point, Gret, spending most of my time now as a public speaker, I absolutely loathe sitting in a little white box by myself. And what I've learned is I love the power of being in a room with people, the chemistry, the buzz, the physicality, the interaction, those, you know, those moments that can't be planned and all the rest of it. And so I know whilst part of my life will continue to be this, working virtually, I know that actually I'm at my most creative and productive when I'm in a room of other people. And so if I had a manager or leader, I'd want to know that manager or leader knew that and helped to create an environment for that to happen.
That's a perfect segue into well-being and well-being at work, because obviously conscious working, we're really focused on embedding well-being into the culture of a business, and know that if you sort of use well-being have well-being as a value, that your people will show up as their whole selves and perform to their best. So I'd love to know throughout your network, what you're hearing about the importance of well-being with businesses and with leaders.
I think what's really interesting again for me, Gret, and I think it was developing, but I think weirdly it's accelerated over the last 2 years, is I think an awful lot of well-being in reality in the workplace was very largely reactive too often. And that actually well-being policies were there to mop up people once they were struggling. You know, it's a bit like the whole health issue, isn't it? Is the best health service one that treats patients really well, or doesn't have to treat patients because they're not there in the first place? And you know, it's the same with any kind of service like this. It's the same with law and order. It's the same with any of those things. And I think a lot of people would have described their well-being policy as talking about, oh, we've got mental first aiders. And what do? Well, they're there to support people who are struggling, who are under stress or pressure. And actually, for me, what's happened over the last couple of years, and I think what's really powerful about the work that you do, is actually we flip that narrative. It isn't about having good people to react to mental health challenges. It's about creating really powerful, productive environments where we're being proactive, and we need less remedial work than we needed before. And I think if people are really going to gauge and measure how successful their well-being policies are, that's it. It shouldn't be a company that becomes arrogant enough to say, oh, we don't need a well-being policy. We don't have any mental health problems here. Well, there are two questions. One is really, and how do you know? But if that's genuinely the case, we need to capture what it is they're doing, because they're doing something right if people are genuinely flourishing in that environment, you know? And so I think for me, that's the key here. You do not have a good well-being policy if all you're doing is supporting people who are struggling. You've only got a really fantastic well-being policy if genuinely people feel supported and developed and trusted and nurtured in an environment where we see the flip of that.
That's perfect. That sort of ties into that idea of leadership and actually creating that culture of well-being, that it's not just one thing. It's actually can be quite unique to each person, but that everyone feels supported.
Exactly.
Would love to know your thoughts on the metrics that should be used to measure well-being and the performance of any investment.
I think that's a really interesting and challenging question. I think it's probably the hardest question of all, right? Look, all I can do is talk to my experience. And I think I said earlier on in the interview, when I became a school principal, I had probably a quarter of the workforce off on either long-term sick or regular sickness. I had 40% of my pupil body regularly punished for misbehavior. A number of those people, we had high exclusion rates where students are basically removed from the school. Now, for me, by the time I left the school, which was 7 years later, we hadn't had one serious incident of indiscipline from a single child in 2.5 years. No member of staff had been off sick with anything other than, you know, a kind of flu or a stomach problem, or And the environment was one where visitors would come into our school and say, this is genuinely the happiest, most productive environment I've ever been in. And they would be able to articulate to me what our vision and values were without knowing what our vision and values were, because it's what they saw in action. Now, I know that might sound soft in some ways, but I think those are the ways we measure how successful our well-being strategies genuinely are. You know, staff retention is an interesting one, and I know it's one we talk about a bit. I think we have to be very careful with using staff retention, because I think 20, 30 years ago, staff retention would have been an absolute key indicator. But I think we're now living with new generations who are coming into the workspace who don't see a job as a job for life, who don't see working in the same place or committing to it for 10, 15, 20 years, who actually want 5 years of real quality development, engagement, interaction, and then they're more nomadic. So I think all we can do in a way is say, have we helped those people journey on? Have we helped develop them? Have we helped meet some of their aspirations and values? And have we given them the self-confidence to take the next step of their journey? So for me, you know, the most powerful metric of all may sound soft and soapy, but it's absolutely true. Are people genuinely queuing up to come to work? Are they leaving with a spring in their step most days? Do they feel supported? In the tough times, do they feel confident enough to express they're having a tough time, or they've screwed up, or they've made a mistake? You know, I suppose in essence, what I'm talking about is psychological safety. But are those things genuine? Are they explicit? And does everybody feel comfortable talking about it and sharing those experiences?
Great answer to what you said is a difficult question. I'd love to know, Richard, how do you support your own well-being?
Well, that's a good question. The first thing I'm going to say, Gret, and I think it's really important to say this, is I am not somebody who spends his life universally happy and positive and content. You know, one of the important qualities of leadership, and I'm going slightly off piece to come back on again, and I say this a lot to leaders and developing leaders, is authenticity. I think vulnerability, fallibility, all of those things are vitally important. And I think it would be quite wrong of me in our interview to say, oh yeah, you know, I look after myself 100%, I've got it mastered. I haven't. And I found it particularly hard as I work for myself. So, you know, I spend a lot of my life working on my own, traveling on my own. I have an extraordinary wife. She is, from the day she first drove me into my career path and my personal life, she's extraordinary. And she's the kind of woman that will provide the right kind of support when necessary. Sometimes she'll kick me up the arse and tell me to stop being so self-indulgent. Sometimes she'll ask me the right questions to help me gain perspective. I've learned, I think, over the years that it's okay to have down days, to have moments of misery. And I'm confident enough to know that when I allow myself to have those moments, that I will come through them, far more so than if I deny them or feel guilty about them. And my goodness me, you know, there have been plenty of despairing days over the last 2 years where I felt anger, despair, loss of hope. But I think I've gained the confidence in myself to know now that allowing myself to have those periods is healthy, and that I will come through them because of my network, my family, my friends, my colleagues, but also because I take the actions I do. I don't feel guilty about stepping away from my work and going for a walk, or letting myself indulge for a few hours in misery, you know, all of those things. And I think the greatest hindrance to people and their sense of mental well-being is feeling guilty about feeling the emotions you do, you know, whether sometimes you feel elated in an environment where you shouldn't. I think that's been a big problem over the last 2 years, where there have been people who have experienced real moments of euphoria during COVID and have felt really guilty about feeling okay and happy and having euphoric moments. You know, for me, just engaging in the nature around me and having a euphoric moment, looking at the birds and thinking, my God, this is an incredible thing to be able to do, and feeling guilty about expressing that to people, or vice versa. You know, feeling guilty that I do feel rubbish, that I don't feel good, that I am having a bad day, that I am riddled with self-doubt. And I think the thing is never to deny yourself the honesty of your emotions. And as a leader and a manager, behaving that way in front of others, because then you role model that that's okay. So I think actually allowing yourself to feel the way you do is really, really important as part of the mental well-being process.
Yeah, it's that idea of mindfulness, something that's so important to what we do in our work. And being aware, just being aware of where you are at a certain moment, what you need to manage that moment, or just to be in that moment, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
So 2022, I saw that you're on LinkedIn Learning, and I'd love for our audience to know what that offer is and how it works.
Yeah, so LinkedIn Learning is an extraordinary thing that I didn't really know about a couple of years ago. And weirdly, they contacted me. In fact, LinkedIn had just bought lynda.com, which at the time I think was the biggest online learning platform in the world. And LinkedIn bought it. And have now really started to redefine and redesign it, because I think for many years, Lynda's mainstay was kind of technical learning around computer programming and stuff like that. And LinkedIn really saw it as a way of broadening professional development and training for a mass market of, well, anyone really. Anyway, they contacted me. This was pre-pandemic, weirdly. And they said, Richard, we really loved your books on change and simple thinking. And we'd love you to work with us to design a couple of courses on the concepting. But typically, you know, we want to give them different names. So can we think of something that's got a similar concepting that we could give unique names to? And then we'd love to fly you over to California. You can film them with us, and then we'll launch them. And I was like, yeah, great, you know, and we worked on re-engineering them. And so I created 2 courses. Remember, this was took about, I'm not successful because I'm good at anything, Gret. If I'm successful, it's because I'm a lucky bugger. So I came up with the course designs prior to COVID. One was on mental toughness and leading a culture of mental toughness in the people you work with and lead. And the other was based on my simple thinking, which was dealing with complexity and managing complexity. Right. So I designed the courses, never got to fly to California to film them because of the pandemic. Filmed them here, actually, in my had an amazing team of whiz kids who made it look like I knew what I was talking about. And they launched the course in November 2020. They've right place, right time. I think they've been hugely resonant to people because millions of people have used those courses to help them, I hope. But LinkedIn Learning is an extraordinary platform. It's amazing because the diversity of offer now, the kind of people from all over the world who are delivering training across a whole range of extraordinary offers are amazing. Many corporations are buying subscriptions to LinkedIn Learning as a really powerful PD tool for their people because it allows autonomy. You know, if you say to an employee, you've now got a subscription to LinkedIn Learning and access to every single course there, go immerse yourself in something new and different. It's an incredible offer. And so, yeah, LinkedIn Learning seems to be an extraordinary and ever expanding place filled with wonders, which allow people real autonomy over their personal and professional development. So, yeah, I'm a big fan. I mean, partly because they pay me a check every month, but I just think it's a wonderful idea. And I've loved doing the courses I've done. And I really hope they've been of use to people over a challenging period of our history.
Well, we'll make sure to put all the details into the notes so people can access at a click of a button. Richard, thank you so much. I mean, I think we could continue talking and talking and talking, but I'm conscious of your time. And I just want to say thank you for all of your insight, your wisdom, such good stories. I really appreciate the time that you've taken. I know our audience will also get a lot out of this interview.
Oh, Gret, it's honestly been such a pleasure. Thank you. So I can't believe the time's flown by. I just say thank you for your passion and what it is you guys do, because right now, I think it is the absolute nugget of what is going to define successful business practice over the next decade or more, hopefully. So thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Richard. And for everyone, be here and be well. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you in the next episode. And by the way, if you like what you heard, then hit subscribe to receive all the future episodes. Better yet, if you're feeling inspired by what you just heard, then leave a review letting me know who else you might want to hear from on Conscious Leaders. To learn more about the show, about conscious working, or Tribe, our membership, head over to our website, consciousworking.co. Yes, it's just CO, so consciousworking.co. And for those of you that might be suffering burnout, we have a great free resource, the Beat Burnout Guide. It's a really simple assessment with tools for you to take action now. Check it out in the show notes so that you can access it immediately. See you in the next episode. Be here and be well.